The Nexus Military Institute on Corval Prime had achieved something remarkable in the annals of galactic education. It had managed to make warfare boring. This was no small feat, considering that most civilized species found the systematic obliteration of their enemies to be fairly stimulating entertainment. But the Institute's administrators had discovered that if you wrapped enough bureaucracy around violence, subjected it to sufficient committee oversight, and mandated enough diversity training seminars, even genocide could become tedious enough to cure insomnia. The campus sprawled across 3 continents of the terraformed world, its chrome and crystal spires reaching toward twin purple suns with the aggressive optimism of a civilization that had never met a problem it couldn't solve by building something taller than it. Hover platforms carried cadets between lecture halls where the galaxy's finest military minds taught the delicate art of converting populated planets into unpopulated real estate through the judicious application of orbital bombardment and philosophical superiority. It was, according to the recruitment materials, where the leaders of tomorrow learned to shape the destiny of galactic civilization. The reality was considerably more bureaucratic. Captain Vak'tal stood 8 feet tall when he bothered to stand straight, which wasn't often since his species had evolved from creatures that spent most of their time lurking in caves waiting for smaller things to walk by. The Keth Mori had transformed this evolutionary heritage into a remarkably successful military philosophy. Wait for your enemies to make mistakes, then eat them. This approach had served them well for approximately 6,000 years of interstellar conquest, though it made them somewhat tedious at faculty meetings. His current assignment teaching advanced tactical operations to mixed species classes was, he frequently reminded anyone within earshot, a waste of his considerable talents. He had personally overseen the subjugation of 14 star systems, authored 3 definitive texts on siege warfare, and once made an entire planetary government surrender by sending them a particularly sarcastic diplomatic note. Being reduced to explaining basic military concepts to cadets who still thought acceptable casualties was a polite suggestion rather than a mathematical requirement struck him as cosmically unjust. This morning's class represented 43 different species from across the galaxy, each contributing their own unique perspective on the fine art of organized violence. The Velthari with their crystalline exoskeletons and calculating minds approached warfare like a particularly complex mathematical proof. The gas-phase Nephilim treated it as an elaborate form of interpretive dance. The Mollusk Collective's representatives managed to convey tactical brilliance through tentacle movements that somehow made perfect sense if you had the right kind of translator software. And then there was the human. Lieutenant Elena Vasquez sat in the 3rd row, maintaining the kind of studious attention that experienced instructors recognized as either genuine engagement or sophisticated sleep mimicry. She was 28 standard years old, which made her practically geriatric by human military standards but still barely past adolescence according to most galactic lifespans. Her species had stumbled onto faster-than-light travel roughly 40 years ago through what the official records diplomatically termed accidental technological breakthrough, and everyone else called they blew up their own moon while testing weapons and somehow created a stable wormhole. The Galactic Integration Protocols mandated that all member species receive equal educational opportunities, regardless of their technological development, cultural sophistication, or demonstrated ability to avoid accidentally destroying celestial bodies. This had led to the enrollment of increasing numbers of humans in advanced military programs, despite their disturbing tendency to treat established tactical doctrine as more of a guideline than actual instruction. Captain Vak'tal had reviewed the classified assessments. Human military history read like a catalogue of impossible victories achieved through methods that should have resulted in catastrophic defeat. They had won battles by pretending to run away, conquered territories by befriending the inhabitants, and somehow convinced superior enemies to surrender through elaborate psychological campaigns that violated every known principle of strategic thinking. Their success rate was statistically inexplicable and philosophically offensive. Today, Captain Vak'tal announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been wrong about anything militarily significant, we will analyze the siege of Malthen 7, a textbook demonstration of proper planetary reduction protocols. The holographic display materialized above the lecture hall, showing a detailed breakdown of what the Keth Mori considered their finest strategic achievement. The operation had taken 18 months, involved 47 capital ships, and had resulted in the complete pacification of a rebellious colony through systematic destruction of industrial infrastructure and selected civilian population centers. The alien cadets leaned forward with appropriate professional interest. The Velthari began calculating resource expenditure ratios with visible enthusiasm. The Nephilim shifted their gaseous forms into patterns that suggested aesthetic appreciation for the geometric precision of orbital bombardment trajectories. Even the notoriously difficult-to-impress crystalline hegemony representative made approving harmonic vibrations. Lieutenant Vasquez remained perfectly still, watching the tactical display with the kind of neutral expression that had made her previous instructors nervous. She had an unfortunate habit of asking questions that sounded innocent, but somehow managed to identify uncomfortable aspects of otherwise flawless military operations. The beauty of this campaign, Captain Vak'tal continued, warming to his favorite subject, lies in its methodical application of overwhelming force. Phase 1 eliminated orbital defenses through concentrated bombardment. Phase 2 destroyed key industrial facilities to prevent weapon production. Phase 3 systematically reduced civilian morale through selective infrastructure targeting. The outcome was inevitable. A Velthari cadet raised one of its crystalline appendages. "Captain, what was the final casualty assessment?" "Approximately 38% of the planetary population," Vak'tal replied without hesitation. "Optimal parameters for this type of resistance suppression." The class buzzed with appreciative murmurs. 38% was considered quite precise by Galactic standards. High enough to ensure compliance, low enough to maintain a viable workforce for post-conquest industrial production. A harmonic chime from the crystalline hegemony section indicated approval. The mathematical progression demonstrates excellent efficiency optimization. Most aesthetically satisfying. Captain Vak'tal's chest swelled with professional pride. Recognition from the crystalline hegemony was worth approximately 7 commendations from lesser civilizations, since they only appreciated military operations that achieved perfect geometric balance between applied force and strategic objectives. "Indeed," he agreed. "This is why proper military education is essential. Warfare is not about emotional responses or primitive aggression. It requires mathematical precision, technological superiority, and above all, understanding the natural hierarchy of galactic civilization." His gaze fixed on Lieutenant Vasquez with a kind of meaningful stare that had ended several promising careers. Some species excel at logistics coordination. Others provide technological innovation. A few demonstrate strategic brilliance. And some. He paused for effect. Some contribute enthusiasm and a willingness to follow established protocols. The human's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in her posture that Captain Vak'tal found mildly unsettling. It was a kind of adjustment that suggested she was re-evaluating something important and wasn't entirely pleased with her conclusions. "Of course," he continued, deciding to make his point more explicit, "theoretical knowledge must be validated through practical application. Tomorrow's exercise will involve recreating the Malthen 7 scenario. Each cadet will command simulated forces and demonstrate their understanding of proper siege methodology." The alien students straightened with anticipation. Combat simulations were considered the highlight of advanced military education, offering opportunities to display their species' natural advantages without the administrative complications of actual warfare. The Velthari could process battlefield calculations faster than most computers. The Nephilim could coordinate simultaneous operations across multiple dimensional phases. The crystalline hegemony's representatives could achieve tactical solutions through pure mathematical harmony. Humans, conversely, had demonstrated a consistent tendency to ignore their instructions, improvise tactically inappropriate responses, and somehow achieve mission objectives through methods that defied strategic analysis. The previous 4 human cadets had been quietly reassigned to diplomatic corps positions after their simulation performances had caused what the administration termed systematic doctrinal confusion. "The parameters will replicate historical conditions exactly," Captain Vak'tal announced with satisfaction. "Same defensive capabilities, identical resource constraints, matching environmental factors. This will enable direct comparison with established tactical benchmarks." Lieutenant Vasquez raised her hand with the careful precision of someone who had learned to phrase dangerous questions diplomatically. "Captain, will we be operating under current Galactic Accord ethical guidelines or historical protocols?" The question settled over the classroom like an unexploded ordnance device. Ethical guidelines were a relatively recent innovation in galactic warfare, introduced by the same progressive political movement that had created species integration protocols. Most military instructors treated them as administrative nuisances rather than actual operational constraints. The simulation will maintain historical accuracy, Vak'tal replied carefully. Standard engagement parameters will apply. Which standard, sir? Keth Mori Conquest Doctrine, Velthari Efficiency Protocols, or the revised Galactic Military Code that was ratified last cycle? The silence that followed was the particular kind of quiet that occurs when everyone present realizes they are witnessing something that will either become legendary or result in someone's expulsion from the academy. The difference between various galactic military doctrines wasn't merely procedural. It was a difference between strategic resource optimization and maybe try not to commit species-wide atrocities. The Galactic Military Code had introduced radical concepts like proportional response and civilian protection protocols that many traditional military educators found philosophically offensive. Captain Vak'tal's scales darkened to their combat shade, indicating either deep contemplation or barely restrained homicidal impulses. His students had learned not to inquire which standard tactical doctrine. He replied with the kind of precision that indicated the discussion was concluded, prioritizes mission accomplishment within acceptable resource parameters. Additional considerations are secondary to strategic objectives. Understood, sir, Vasquez replied, settling back with an expression of perfect professional compliance. But Captain Vak'tal had studied enough primitive species psychology to recognize that particular look. It was the expression humans wore when they were planning something that would make perfect sense to them and absolutely no sense to anyone else. He made a mental note to ensure the simulation's safety protocols were functioning at maximum sensitivity. The rest of the briefing proceeded without incident, though several observant alien students noticed that the human cadet spent most of her time accessing historical databases rather than tactical manuals. When the session concluded, she was among the first to leave, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had research to conduct and calculations to complete. Captain Vak'tal watched her departure with growing unease. In his experience, confident humans were exponentially more dangerous than confused ones. Confused humans at least failed in predictable ways. The simulation complex occupied an entire underground level of the Institute, its walls lined with quantum processing matrices capable of creating virtual environments indistinguishable from actual combat conditions. Advanced cadets had been known to complete entire campaigns without realizing they hadn't left the building, which spoke either to the sophistication of the technology or the focused tunnel vision that came with intensive military education. The following morning found the cadets assembled in the preparation chamber, each wearing neural interface crowns that would translate their consciousness into the simulation environment. The technology was sufficiently impressive to make most primitive species weep with technological envy, though humans had developed an annoying habit of treating it like elaborate entertainment rather than serious military training. Captain Vak'tal monitored the initialization procedures from his Instructor platform, observing biometric readings and psychological profiles with professional interest. The alien students displayed expected patterns of focused determination mixed with competitive anxiety. Their neural activities indicated they were reviewing tactical scenarios and optimizing resource allocation strategies. Lieutenant Vasquez's readings were entirely different. Her stress indicators were below baseline. Her neural patterns suggested she was reviewing something that resembled historical comedy databases, and her biometrics indicated she was genuinely enjoying herself. Captain Vak'tal had observed similar readings before, typically moments before human military units violated several laws of physics and most principles of rational behavior. Simulation parameters locked, announced the chamber's artificial intelligence in the kind of soothing voice that suggested it had been programmed by species who found organized violence relaxing. Each cadet commands standard siege forces, 24 heavy cruisers, 72 attack craft, and ground forces sufficient for planetary occupation. Defensive parameters match. Historical Malthen 7 engagement records. Victory requires complete population compliance within standard 18-month timeframe. The alien cadets acknowledged the parameters with professional understanding. These were familiar constraints, well within the capabilities of properly trained military officers. The simulation would test their ability to coordinate complex operations under resource pressure, but the outcome was essentially predetermined by technological superiority and established doctrine. Additional notation: the AI continued with electronic cheerfulness. Ethical constraint protocols have been suspended for historical accuracy. Standard engagement limitations do not apply. Captain Vak'tal smiled with genuine satisfaction. The constraint protocols had been among the more irritating innovations in military education, forcing students to consider long-term consequences and collateral damage rather than focusing on immediate tactical objectives. Removing them would allow his cadets to demonstrate their true capabilities without bureaucratic interference. The simulation began with the spectacular visual displays that made military recruitment videos so effective across the galaxy. 24 massive warships materialized in high orbit around a blue-green world that bore uncomfortable similarities to several inhabited planets throughout the galaxy. Below them, defensive installations powered up with energy signatures indicating a civilization that had progressed beyond primitive technology, but hadn't yet achieved true interstellar capability. The alien cadets initiated their operations with textbook precision. Orbital bombardment eliminated key defensive positions within the first 2 hours. Atmospheric entry vehicles deployed ground forces to strategic coordinates with geometric perfection. Communication networks were systematically disrupted, preventing organized resistance. By any reasonable assessment, the operations were proceeding flawlessly. Then Lieutenant Vasquez began her approach. Her fleet moved with patterns that seemed almost random, but somehow avoided every significant defensive installation. Instead of beginning with standard bombardment protocols, she deployed reconnaissance platforms that mapped civilian population centers with suspicious thoroughness. Her communication intercepts focused on cultural databases rather than military intelligence networks. Curious tactical variation: observe the Velthari cadet monitoring comparative approaches. Though I cannot identify the strategic advantage of detailed civilian mapping. Captain Vak'tal was beginning to share that confusion. Established doctrine called for rapid military victory followed by administrative occupation. Detailed cultural analysis was typically handled by specialized anthropological teams months after conquest completion. The human appeared to be approaching the simulation as if she planned to establish permanent residence rather than military control. Perhaps she's attempting psychological warfare applications, suggested the Nephilim representative, though her methodology appears dimensionally inefficient. The simulation continued, and alien cadets achieved their objectives with admirable consistency. Planetary resistance collapsed under coordinated assault, governmental structures were neutralized, and strategic resources were secured. Average completion time was 15.7 months, slightly ahead of historical benchmarks. Lieutenant Vasquez's fleet hadn't engaged a single target. Instead, she had spent the first 12 months conducting what appeared to be comprehensive sociological research. Her reconnaissance platforms had mapped not just military installations but educational facilities, medical centers, cultural sites, and what the analysis programs identified as recreational gathering spaces. Her communication intercepts had produced detailed analyses of local art forms, religious practices, and social organizational structures. Lieutenant Vasquez, Captain Vak'tal announced through the simulation's communication system, his voice carrying across virtual space with digital authority, "Your tactical approach appears to deviate significantly from established protocols. Perhaps you would benefit from observing your colleagues' more conventional methodologies." The response arrived with the kind of calm professionalism that experienced instructors had learned to interpret as a warning sign. Acknowledged, Captain. I'm implementing alternative strategy based on available intelligence. Alternative how, exactly? Vak'tal demanded, though he was already developing suspicions about answers he might not want to receive. I'm treating this as a contact scenario rather than conquest operation, sir. Intelligence indicates this civilization has never encountered extraterrestrial contact. Their defensive measures are designed for conventional warfare between equivalent technological levels. They lack conceptual frameworks for orbital siege tactics. Captain Vak'tal felt his scales shift to their deepest alarm coloration. Lieutenant, this is not a contact simulation. This is a military siege exercise with clearly defined parameters and victory conditions. Yes, sir. But ethical constraint protocols were suspended, which means I'm authorized to interpret victory conditions according to optimal strategic outcomes rather than prescribed methodology. The words hung in digital space like a tactical nuclear device with malfunctioning safety systems. Captain Vak'tal suddenly realized that removing ethical constraints hadn't eliminated moral considerations from the simulation. It had eliminated the restrictions that kept human tactical thinking within acceptable boundaries. Lieutenant Vasquez, he said with the careful precision of someone diffusing explosive ordnance, please clarify your interpretation of victory conditions. Complete population compliance within 18 months, sir. I believe I can accomplish this without engaging hostile forces. The silence that followed was a profound quiet that occurs when everyone present realizes they are witnessing either revolutionary genius or complete tactical insanity, and nobody can determine which. Month 15 began with Lieutenant Vasquez's fleet finally moving into active engagement positions. But instead of attacking military installations, her ships began broadcasting on all planetary communication frequencies simultaneously. The transmissions weren't demands for surrender or threats of annihilation. They were greetings. Not generic communications, but carefully crafted messages demonstrating detailed understanding of local cultural patterns, historical achievements, artistic traditions, and social values. Each transmission was personalized for its intended recipients, delivered in perfect linguistic syntax, with cultural references indicating months of anthropological study. The planetary population's response was immediate and unprecedented. Instead of mobilizing for desperate resistance, they began attempting to respond. Military installations powered down weapons systems to redirect energy toward communication arrays. Government leaders canceled emergency sessions to coordinate contact protocols with scientific communities. Defense networks designed to repel invasion attempts were reconfigured to facilitate diplomatic exchange. Captain Vak'tal observed the tactical displays with mounting horror as he realized what was transpiring. The human cadet hadn't discovered a method to conquer the planet more efficiently. She had made conquest unnecessary by transforming the entire operation into something completely different. This is not proper military doctrine, he announced to the simulation chamber, though his voice lacked its customary authoritative confidence. No, sir, came the response from within the virtual environment. It's superior. Month 17 witnessed the completion of preliminary diplomatic protocols between Vasquez's fleet and planetary leadership. Technology transfer agreements had been outlined, cultural exchange programs were under development, and mutual defense treaties were being negotiated. The planet's military forces had been voluntarily restructured into a joint exploration fleet, and their industrial capacity was being integrated into Vasquez's supply network through cooperative agreements. Victory conditions had been achieved 1 month ahead of schedule, but in a manner that rendered the entire concept of victory meaningless. There was no conquest, no occupation, no resistance to suppress. Instead, there was partnership, mutual advancement, and strategic alliance that could influence galactic politics for centuries. Captain Vak'tal realized he was observing the most tactically brilliant and strategically terrifying performance he had ever witnessed. The human cadet had achieved total victory by refusing to conduct warfare, and in doing so had demonstrated capabilities that made his species' military doctrine appear primitive by comparison. Simulation complete, announced the artificial intelligence with electronic satisfaction. All victory conditions achieved ahead of schedule. Lieutenant Vasquez's tactical innovation will be documented for further analysis. The neural interface crowns powered down, returning students to physical reality. Alien cadets emerged from their virtual campaigns with satisfied expressions of species who had performed competently according to established standards. They had accomplished their objectives, demonstrated proper tactical knowledge, and maintained acceptable casualty ratios. Lieutenant Vasquez removed her interface crown with the calm satisfaction of someone who had just completed a pleasant afternoon's work rather than revolutionizing interstellar military doctrine. Lieutenant Vasquez, Captain Vak'tal announced, his voice carrying across the simulation chamber with barely controlled tension, report to my office for performance debriefing. Other students exchanged glances with the universal recognition of beings who had just witnessed something that would result in either commendations or court-martial proceedings. Possibly both simultaneously. Captain Vak'tal's office occupied a corner of the Institute's administrative complex, its walls decorated with military honors indicating both professional competence and disturbing enthusiasm for solving problems through organized violence. Holographic battle displays showed his most celebrated victories, each representing masterful strategic planning and tactical execution. Lieutenant Vasquez sat across from his desk with the relaxed posture of someone who was either completely innocent or completely confident. Captain Vak'tal had studied enough human psychology to understand that with this species, there was frequently no meaningful distinction between the two conditions. "Lieutenant," he began, selecting his words with the care of someone navigating diplomatic minefields, "your performance in today's simulation was unprecedented." "Thank you, sir." The simple response somehow managed to convey gratitude, professional pride, and subtle challenge simultaneously. Captain Vak'tal found himself wondering if human communication always carried multiple layers of meaning or if this particular human was exceptionally sophisticated. "It was not entirely intended as praise," he clarified. "Military simulations are designed to evaluate your ability to apply established tactical doctrine under controlled conditions. Your approach deviated substantially from prescribed methodology." "Yes, sir. I noticed that prescribed methodology resulted in approximately 38% civilian casualties and complete destruction of planetary infrastructure. I considered more efficient alternatives might exist." Captain Vak'tal felt his scales shifting toward their darkest combat configuration. Efficiency is measured by mission completion within acceptable resource parameters. Civilian casualties are expected components of military operations. "Expected by whom, sir?" The question was delivered with perfect professional neutrality, but somehow managed to carry implicit challenge that made Captain Vak'tal's predatory instincts respond with uncomfortable intensity. Humans possessed an annoying tendency to ask questions that sounded reasonable until you attempted to answer them. "By established military doctrine," he replied, falling back on institutional authority. "The Galactic Military Council has determined that civilian casualty rates below 40% are acceptable for siege operations. I achieved 0% civilian casualties while completing the mission ahead of schedule and gaining strategic allies rather than occupied territory. By what metric is 38% more acceptable than 0%? Captain Vak'tal realized he was being led into philosophical discussion about fundamental assumptions underlying galactic military policy. This was dangerous territory for an instructor whose career had been built on following established protocols rather than questioning them. "Lieutenant," he said with firm authority that had concluded similar conversations previously, "military doctrine exists because it has been validated through centuries of successful operations. Innovation is commendable, but it cannot replace proven methodology." "Proven for what purpose, sir?" The Malthen 7 siege resulted in tactical victory, but the planet required 60 years of occupation forces and never achieved full integration into the Kethmari Empire. My approach would have created immediate strategic partnership with long-term benefits and no ongoing security costs. The human was correct, and Captain Vak'tal knew it. The Malthen 7 siege had been strategically problematic despite tactical success. But acknowledging this would require admitting that human primitive thinking had identified flaws in advanced military doctrine that his own species had overlooked for millennia. "Your methodology," he said instead, "relied on cultural analysis and diplomatic negotiation. These are not military skills." "With respect, sir, I believe they are precisely military skills. The purpose of warfare is achieving political objectives through organized force. If you can accomplish identical objectives without using force, you've won more decisively than if you'd destroyed everything." Captain Vak'tal found himself confronting a logical trap with no acceptable escape routes. Either the human was wrong, in which case her tactical success was irrelevant, or she was correct, in which case everything he had been teaching was inefficient at best and barbarically primitive at worst. "Lieutenant Vasquez," he said with careful precision of someone about to make decisions that might terminate his career, "your simulation performance demonstrates creative thinking, but military operations require predictable outcomes based on established precedent. Innovation cannot be permitted to override discipline." "I understand, sir. You're saying that maintaining established procedures is more important than achieving superior results." The statement hung in air between them like an accusation. Captain Vak'tal realized he was being offered an opportunity to reconsider his position, but accepting it would require acknowledging that a primitive human cadet had demonstrated superior tactical understanding to his own. His pride made the decision for him. "I'm saying," he replied with cold authority that had established his reputation throughout Kethmari military circles, "that junior cadets should focus on mastering established doctrine before presuming to improve upon it. Your approach to today's simulation, while creative, demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of military objectives." Lieutenant Vasquez's expression remained unchanged, but something subtle shifted in her posture. It was the kind of adjustment predators made when they realized diplomatic solutions had failed and more direct measures might become necessary. "I see," she said with perfect professional courtesy. "So you're telling me that achieving superior results through improved methodology is less important than following orders, regardless of outcome." "I'm telling you," Captain Vak'tal replied, his voice carrying institutional authority and personal conviction, "that military discipline requires respect for established hierarchy. Innovation has its place, but that place is not in direct contradiction to superior officers' instructions." "Understood, sir. And if I continue achieving superior results through an authorized methodology?" Captain Vak'tal smiled with predatory satisfaction that his species had perfected through millions of years of evolutionary development. This was familiar territory, direct challenge to authority that could be met with appropriate disciplinary response. "Then you will discover that academic performance is only one component of military evaluation. Attitude, cooperation, and respect for chain of command are equally important. Cadets who cannot demonstrate these qualities find their career options become significantly limited." The threat was sufficiently clear that even primitive humans should understand it. Captain Vak'tal had used similar warnings throughout his teaching career, and they had proven remarkably effective at redirecting overly creative students toward more acceptable behavioral patterns. Lieutenant Vasquez nodded with apparent understanding, though something in her eyes suggested she was processing the information in ways that might not lead to expected conclusions. "So what you're saying," she replied with calm reasonableness that made experienced officers verify their weapon status, "is that you intend to punish superior performance because it threatens your authority." Captain Vak'tal felt his combat instincts activate as he realized the human had just transformed a disciplinary conversation into something considerably more dangerous. Her words carried characteristics of formal challenge, the kind of direct confrontation that his species handled through ritualized combat rather than administrative procedures. "I am saying," he replied through clenched teeth, "that junior officers who cannot follow orders are liability to their units and danger to their colleagues. Military organizations are not places for individuals who believe personal judgment supersedes institutional wisdom, even when that personal judgment produces objectively superior results." "Especially then," Captain Vak'tal snapped, his patience finally exhausted. "Primitive species always believe their simplistic solutions are superior to advanced methodology. This is precisely why integration protocols exist, to help lesser civilizations understand their proper role in galactic civilization." The words escaped before he could reconsider them, carrying species-based prejudice that integration protocols were specifically designed to prevent. Captain Vak'tal realized he had just violated several institutional regulations while simultaneously insulting the representative of allied civilization. But damage was done, and his pride wouldn't permit retreat from the position he had taken. "Let me be perfectly clear, Lieutenant," he continued, his voice carrying full institutional authority backed by personal conviction. "Humans are recent additions to galactic civilization. Your species barely achieved interstellar capability, and your military doctrine is primitive by reasonable standards. The fact that you achieved unconventional result in one simulation does not qualify you to question methodologies proven successful across multiple galactic conflicts." Lieutenant Vasquez sat perfectly still, listening with focused attention that suggested she was memorizing every word for future reference. When Captain Vak'tal finished his declaration, she remained silent for an extended moment, processing what she had heard with careful consideration of someone making important decisions. "Captain," she said finally, her voice carrying quality that made his predatory instincts respond with sudden unease, "are you ordering me to achieve inferior results in order to demonstrate proper respect for authority?" The question was phrased with perfect military courtesy, but somehow managed to carry implicit threat that made Captain Vak'tal's survival instincts generate warnings he couldn't quite interpret. "I am ordering you," he replied, choosing words with precision of someone establishing terms for formal combat, to follow established protocols and demonstrate appropriate respect for superior knowledge and experience. "And if I don't?" Captain Vak'tal smiled with genuine predatory satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of direct challenge he understood completely. The human had finally abandoned diplomatic pretense and revealed her true nature: primitive, aggressive, and fundamentally incapable of accepting proper civilized authority. "Then you will learn exactly why disciplinary measures exist," he replied with confidence of someone who had never encountered problems that couldn't be solved through application of superior force and institutional power. Lieutenant Vasquez nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had suspected throughout their conversation. "I see," she said with perfect calm. "So this isn't actually about military effectiveness or educational standards. This is about ensuring primitive humans understand their place in your galactic hierarchy." "Precisely," Captain Vak'tal agreed, pleased that she finally comprehended the situation correctly. Integration protocols exist to help lesser species contribute meaningfully to galactic civilization without overestimating their capabilities or disrupting established order. "And you believe my tactical success threatens that order?" "I believe," Captain Vak'tal replied with satisfaction of someone delivering final, unanswerable argument, "that primitive species who achieve temporary success through luck or accident often develop dangerous delusions about their actual capabilities. It is my responsibility to correct such misunderstandings before they lead to more serious problems." Lieutenant Vasquez stood from her chair with fluid grace, her movement carrying controlled precision that suggested extensive training in disciplines Captain Vak'tal couldn't immediately identify. "Captain," she said with quiet intensity that made intelligent beings reconsider their life choices, "I want to be absolutely certain I understand your position. You're telling me that achieving superior results through innovative methodology is unacceptable because it demonstrates human capabilities exceed your expectations." "I'm telling you that one successful simulation does not constitute proof of superior capability," Captain Vak'tal replied, though something in the human's tone was beginning to make him question the wisdom of this entire exchange. "And you're saying that rather than examining whether human methodology might offer improvements to established doctrine, you prefer to suppress it entirely?" "I'm saying that military discipline requires—" "You're saying," Lieutenant Vasquez interrupted with quiet authority that somehow carried more weight than his shouting, "that you would rather maintain your sense of superiority than acknowledge that primitive humans might have something to teach advanced galactic civilization." Captain Vak'tal felt the conversation slipping beyond his control as he realized the human had somehow transformed his reasonable disciplinary action into indictment of his personal character and professional competence. "Lieutenant," he said with warning tone that had concluded many military careers, "you are approaching insubordination. I suggest you reconsider your attitude before this conversation has consequences you cannot undo." Lieutenant Vasquez smiled with calm confidence that made experienced predators look for escape routes. "Captain," she replied with perfect professional courtesy, "don't push me." Captain Vak'tal laughed. It was a mistake that would haunt him for the remainder of his considerably abbreviated career, though he wouldn't realize it for several more minutes. The sound echoed through his office with mocking arrogance that his species used to establish dominance over defeated enemies. It carried with it millennia of evolutionary superiority, technological advancement, and cultural sophistication. It was the laugh of apex predator acknowledging amusing audacity of prey that had forgotten its proper place in the natural order. It was also the last sound he made as respected member of galactic military establishment. Lieutenant Vasquez's response began with single communication burst transmitted through the Institute's quantum network to every military installation, government office, and academic institution within 15 parsecs. The message was brief, professionally formatted, and absolutely devastating in its implications. It contained complete tactical records from every simulation exercise conducted at Nexus Military Institute for the past 7 years, along with detailed analysis demonstrating systematic patterns of inefficiency, strategic blindness, and tactical doctrine that prioritized institutional prejudice over actual military effectiveness. The data showed human cadets consistently achieved superior results when permitted to operate without doctrinal restrictions, but were systematically suppressed through discriminatory evaluation standards that measured compliance rather than competence. The second phase involved release of classified psychological profiles, revealing how faculty members' species-based prejudices influenced teaching methods, grading standards, and career recommendations. Documentation showed human students were routinely subjected to impossible standards while being denied access to advanced training opportunities automatically granted to alien cadets with inferior performance records. The third phase was personal. Lieutenant Vasquez had spent 8 months at the Institute, and during that time had quietly documented every instance of discriminatory treatment, institutional bias, and professional incompetence she had encountered. Her files contained detailed records of instructors who had violated educational protocols, administrators who had manipulated evaluation criteria, and senior officers who had used their positions to advance their species' interests at expense of genuine military effectiveness. Captain Vak'tal's personal records were particularly comprehensive. They showed pattern of tactical decisions that had resulted in unnecessary casualties, strategic assessments proven wrong by subsequent events, and educational methodology that had systematically failed to prepare students for actual combat conditions. His celebrated victory at Malthen 7 was revealed to have been strategic disaster requiring 60 years of occupation forces that had ultimately failed to achieve meaningful integration into the Kethmari Empire. But the fourth phase transformed bureaucratic scandal into existential crisis for Galactic military doctrine. Lieutenant Vasquez had used her institute access to analyze tactical records from every major military conflict in recent Galactic history. Her research had identified systematic patterns of strategic thinking that prioritized technological superiority and numerical advantage over genuine tactical innovation. The data demonstrated that Galactic military doctrine had become so dependent on overwhelming force that it had lost ability to adapt to unconventional challenges. More importantly, her analysis had identified 19 ongoing conflicts where human tactical methodology could achieve decisive victory within months rather than decades of attritional warfare that current Galactic doctrine predicted. The implications were staggering. If human methods were genuinely superior, then the entire foundation of Galactic military hierarchy was based on technological intimidation rather than actual tactical competence. If primitive humans could consistently outperform advanced civilizations through superior strategic thinking, then perhaps the primitives weren't quite as primitive as everyone assumed. Captain Vak'tal watched his career dissolve in real time as communication networks throughout the galaxy buzzed with analysis of Lieutenant Vasquez's data dump. Military commands that had dismissed human tactical contributions for decades suddenly found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness. Academic institutions began urgent reviews of their evaluation criteria. Government officials started asking uncomfortable questions about why their expensive military establishments were being consistently outperformed by representatives of species they had been assured were intellectually inferior. The final phase was almost anticlimactic. Within 72 hours, Lieutenant Vasquez received 17 different offers for advanced command positions from military organizations that had suddenly realized they needed someone who could win wars efficiently rather than impressively. Captain Vak'tal received notification that his teaching contract would not be renewed, his tactical writings were being withdrawn from circulation pending review, and his security clearance was under investigation for potential professional incompetence. The Nexus Military Institute hastily announced comprehensive reforms to their evaluation procedures, though privately their administrators were questioning whether they understood warfare as well as they had assumed. Other military academies throughout the galaxy began similar reviews, discovering that their most successful graduates weren't necessarily the ones who had followed established doctrine most precisely. And somewhere in the chaos of revolutionized military education, Lieutenant Elena Vasquez quietly accepted a position commanding Joint Species Tactical Development, where she would spend the next several years teaching advanced civilizations how primitive humans approach.